The writing of the Constitution. This lecture will focus on the writing of the Constitution. As you should remember from your American history class, there were many influences on the framers of the Constitution. Documents such as the Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, and Declaration of Rights, which focus on protecting the rights of citizens from an abusive government, influenced the writing of the Constitution. The Articles of Confederation created a government dominated by the states. This new government had no president or national court, and the national legislature that existed was extremely weak. These weaknesses prevented the government from solving many of the problems the new nation faced. To compound the weaknesses of the national government, states were growing in power due to many changes that were occurring. The biggest change was expansion of voting laws to include all white males, which in turn increased the political power among the new middle class. This new middle class included artisans and small land-owning farmers. This new middle class also counterbalanced and threatened the power of the traditional wealthy merchants and landowners. Due to the post-war depression, many small farmers were unable to pay their debts and their farms were being foreclosed. Since many legislatures were now governed by people who were sympathetic to the framers, the laws that passed concerning debt collection often favored the small farmers and not the creditors. In addition, many states were printing their own money, which was worthless, and the creditors were forced to accept that money as payment. Eventually, tension between farmers and creditors erupted into Shays' Rebellion, when farmers rebelled against the foreclosing of their homes and farms. Shays' Rebellion would be the wake-up call. Everyone now realized that the Articles of Confederation were ineffective in governing the new nation. So off to Philadelphia the farmers go to draft a new constitution. As you can imagine, when the framers met in Philadelphia, they all came with their own agenda, and there were many disagreements. Among the biggest disagreements were over representation in the legislature and slavery. Lines were drawn between large and small states, and slaveholding states and non-slaveholding states. Hopefully, this information is a review from last year, so I will not spend much time on it. States introduced their own ideas on the structure of the government. The New Jersey plan benefited the small states because representation in Congress was equal, while the Virginia plan benefited the large states because representation in Congress was based on population. How do they reconcile both plans? The Connecticut Compromise, of course. Just in case you forgot, the Connecticut Compromise is also known as the Great Compromise. The Connecticut Compromise created a bicameral legislature. Representation in the House of Representatives would be based on population, and representation in the Senate would also be equal. Not only was representation an issue, but also who was able to vote. The framers decided to dodge that bullet and leave it up to the states. We will examine how that worked out throughout the course of this year. The 3/5 Compromise resolved a dispute over slavery and representation. As with any compromise, both sides get and both sides give. The South was able to count 3/5 of their slaves as part of the population, which in turn increased the representation in the House of Representatives. However, in return, the South had to pay a tax for every slave they counted, which made the northern states happy in that it increased federal revenue. Another compromise concerning slavery is a commerce and slave trade compromise. Southern states feared the government would tax exports from their states, and northern states feared that slavery would spread. The compromise that was reached would ban the importing of slaves after 1808, and Congress would not tax exports from any state. If you think about the weaknesses of the government under the Articles of Confederation, the biggest among them was the lack of control Congress had over the economy. The Constitution clearly gave Congress the upper hand over the states when it came to the economy. Congress was given the role of chief economic policymaker. This gave Congress the power to tax and borrow money and to spend the nation's money. In other words, appropriate funds. Congress was also given the power to protect property rights. These powers include the power to punish counterfeiters, protect patents and copyrights, and to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. Although the Constitution expanded the powers of Congress, it also restricted the powers of Congress. This slide lists some of the provisions that restrict the power of Congress while at the same time protect the rights of the individual. I am not going to take the time to explain each of these protections. However, you are responsible for knowing these things when you complete the Constitution scavenger hunt. The explanation of these features of the Constitution is found in Chapter 2 under the Individual Issue section. Okay, so the framers listed protections for the people within the Constitution, but are those protections enough? For the Federalists, the answer is yes, and for the Anti-Federalists, the answer is no. The framers had to decide if additional protections were needed beyond those listed in the text of the Constitution. What rights would be included? Would only the rights listed in the Bill of Rights be the only ones protected? Well, if you were a Federalist, you believed the Constitution limited the government enough and that those powers not listed would be considered inferior to those that were listed, and you did not want that. If you were an anti-federalist, you believed a strong central government would threaten the freedoms fought for, and that Congress was given too much power with the necessary and proper clause. We will go into more detail about the necessary and proper clause in class. This clause gave Congress the power to tax and the supremacy of the national laws over those of the states. The Federalist Papers were a series of articles written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. They were published in New York newspapers in defense of the ratification of the Constitution. The Federalist Papers are important because they explain in detail the purposes and meaning of the Constitution. Many of the topics of each article address the objections of the anti-federalists who were afraid the new government would erode the fundamental liberties of the people and weaken the power of the states. Eventually, cooler heads prevailed and an agreement was reached to ratify the Constitution with a later edition of the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was ratified in 1788 and the Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. In class, after you do the Constitution scavenger hunt, we will go into further detail about what the Constitution actually says.